Dear Yanis, dear Jackie, dear Fabian, thank you for those kind words. I'm not yet dead, so you can wait for the final laudatio for later on. One of my teachers in politics told me 60 years ago, not 25 years, 60 years ago, I apologize for that, that politics was in essence about power. Power to achieve goals for society as a whole. This is not the place to philosophize more deeply about this. I immediately switch to the European Union. Some years ago, it was said that the European Commission was a political commission, remember. But it has always been so since 1958. It has power, I mean the Commission. It is not about management or execution. It even has, Commission, a monopoly on legislative initiatives. The present Commission says it wants to be geopolitical, not political, geopolitical. But again, it has been so for a long time. Whoever largely determines the trade policy of the world's largest trading bloc is involved in geopolitics. After all, the latter concept is not just about war and peace. Geopolitics is a broad concept. Today, it is also about climate, the biggest issue of our time. The European Union played a key role in the latest COP conferences, most recently in Sharm el-Sheikh. What geopolitical role are we not aiming for? The Union does not dream nostalgically of the past when some member states were real world powers, albeit in the colonial times. I never heard the slogan, "Make Europe great again." At the other end of the spectrum are people who are afraid of the word power. I know that a number of member states prefer to see the EU as a market rather than a might, and it's much more than just playing with words. I will go one step further. The EU, according to these cool lovers of the EU, should not engage in power politics, but should act according to economic so-called rationality. It should stick to the rules at all costs. But what in a world of primacy of politics, of increasing unilateralism, of unfair competition, not of one global partners, but of all global actors? Is the Union then doomed to stand by powerlessly? In the internal struggle between principles and interests, the EU must not be condemned to principles only, under the motto, better to die for its own principles than those of another. We also have interests, European interests. We have to protect them without falling into real protectionism. The EU has long since ceased to be the European Economic Community, a mere single market. It's a political union, albeit a very specific one. The Lisbon Treaty demonstrates this well. The interpretation of it in practice since 2009 also shows well that there is more political unification every year. Political union is on its way. Besides, that's why the British have left. If they ever return, they should accept that fact. If not, they best stay out. Paradoxically, among the European institutions themselves, power is not a dirty word. With some imagination in the Union, we also have a trias politica, with legislative, judicial, and executive powers, and where the powers keep each other in balance. The European Council collectively plays the role of head of state in a kind of presidential regime. Its president is himself important only because he presides over an important institution. The Council is not accountable to Parliament, but it cannot do without the legislative powers. And Parliament cannot do without the member states. If not, no law comes into being. The Commission is part of the European Council and must get the confidence of the Parliament. Everything is in everything and vice versa. No one can say in Europe today that he or she alone has the power. At most, one can say that this or that one is the most powerful, or that one is more powerful than the other. Because politics is about power, there is a power struggle. But one does not have to ask whether in a parliament, in a perma-crisis, in existential crisis, when one does not have to ask there is room for personal or institutional rivalry or power struggles. To ask the question is to answer it. There is no room. Should one not be able to rise above private interests to work jointly with all actors for the common European good? Fortunately, this does happen, but too often one has to wait for a crisis to take difficult and courageous decisions. At global level, shouldn't we be able to rise above rivalries to work together for the good of humanity, for example, on climate change? If not, the Titanic of humanity is sinking. Everyone is losing. However, I would add, if there is a general mistrust among global actors, it becomes difficult to act exceptionally alone in one area in mutual trust, such as climate change. Sometimes politics shows powerlessness rather than power. In the Eurozone, the unnamed financial markets or powers were our biggest enemy. I did not notice much of the rationality of the markets then, by the way. Increasingly, another example, there is the power of social media and its owners. How is it possible that one man can say whether truth or lie is being told on Twitter? It is Orwellian. Faced with the barbarity of the Russian power today, the EU is opting for counterpower. For too long, it has believed that interdependence is the way to peace. And therefore, what is true within the EU does not apply with countries that hold totally different values or unvalues. As a result, for us today, security is ultimately more important than cheap energy, because life is more important than death. Freedom is worth more than money. And this is why the EU chose to fund arms supplies, unilateral economic sanctions, freezing of assets of collaborating oligarchs, etc. It is no longer a time for powerlessness, but of the power and the strength of our convictions. Political institutions, especially in a democracy, ultimately get power from the people through elections. Again, paradoxically, parts of the population feel no power, but only powerlessness towards their elected representatives. 37% of the Belgians, according to a survey, would feel that a good dictatorship is not a bad thing. The same feeling prevails in other countries. Citizens then choose definitive powerlessness in an authoritarian state to react against powerlessness within a democracy. Understand who can. In fact, some of our fellow citizens want something different. Many want to retain their freedom of speech in an authoritarian regime. One wants to continue to democratically oppose a supposedly undemocratic state. It won't. Ask many Chinese or Russian citizens today, how they see it. We need to respond to that sense of helplessness through policies that achieve faster and better results on climate change, on migration, on job security, on poverty, on criminality, and so on. We need more recourse to deliberative democracy alongside representative democracy, starting at the local level. We also need to get back to treating each other in a respectful manner, far from the Twitter culture or lack thereof. Free speech is something other than free swearing and other than free and shameless lying. It reminds me of the state lies of authoritarian states. The crisis of European democracy is only part of the crisis of democracy at large. Fortunately, populism is on the rebound in many places, such as the United States, the UK, Brazil, and in a number of European countries, according to opinion polls. We will see what happens in Italy in policies in themselves. A modern society is complex and will remain so. Populism lives off simplisms. Their greatest enemy is facts, and therefore they are the enemies of fact-based arguments. On the other hand, authoritarianism is under pressure. In Russia, in Turkey, even in China. Don't underestimate what is happening there. Global actors are all practicing strategic autonomy, but nobody wants to go down to the road to complete autarky because it is the road to impoverishment. If we still remain dependent on each other to some extent, there is sharing of power. No one rules the world alone. The heart of the matter is that we, as the EU, should not be too dependent in strategic areas, such as energy, defense, and others. How can one be geopolitically relevant if one is too dependent on other global actors? Question mark. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, in that jungle, the European Union, member states, and citizens must find their way and find their place without fear, uncomplexed. Fear only leads to despair and to violence, to war. One must want to hope. The less the time is ripe, the more we must do to make it ripe. Nothing is lost. The real decadence is war. The real decadence is being a people who can or should only obey, trembling with fear. This is exactly the opposite of what Europe is and how Europeans see themselves. We will turn fear into hope. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Herman. And thank you for everything, as always, insightful and thought-provoking, and many things to come back to in our discussion today.